In today's video, we're gonna get super supple and look at not one, but two suspension seat posts. Which one is for you? Which one should you buy? What do I think about them? Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers. And if you're new to the channel, if you love your bike but don't race the supple life, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. I'm gonna preface this by saying that the whole idea of suspension seat posts did not get me excited at first. I've been kind of sitting on these reviews for quite some time, pardon the pun. But I will say, after having tried both the seat posts in varying terrain, especially on the city streets here in Tucson, they're making me a believer. So in this video, we're gonna talk about two of them. They're both very similar, but also kind of different and unique if you ride them back to back. And I'll give you my impressions of each and try to give you guys information so you can figure out if one of these is right for you. Full disclosure, both these seat posts were sent to me to review. And for me, the purpose of this review is not to sell you these seat posts, but to describe them as accurately as possible. So if you are interested in one of these, you can make the right decision. So I'm gonna take a look at the Kinetic seat posts first. So the Kinetic seat posts, previously called Cirrus or Body Float. I'm not quite sure the history of the name of the brand, but now known as Kinetic. This uses a two-spring system right up here, right below where the saddle attaches to the seat post itself. It weighs in at about 577 grams. So if you're a weight weenie, both these seat posts are gonna give you pause. When you purchase the seat post, it's generally set up for different weight ranges. You can get different springs for this. I believe they have springs that will suspend a rider up to 300 pounds. One thing I really love about the seat post in particular is the way you control the suspension. There's a little control knob here that you can tighten or loosen, and there's a scale here so you can always set it to your preferred setting. And this allows you to make it softer or firmer. I tend to set mine a little bit on the further side just because I'm not a fan of pedal bob, and you can do that on the fly right here. One thing to note about the seat post is all the suspending elements are up here, not down here at the bottom. This is just empty. So if you do want to save some weight, you could cut this down a little bit. So contrast this seat post with this one by Redshift Sports. This seat post, when using a single spring, weighs in at about 544 grams, so a little bit lighter than this guy. But if you add the second spring in here to kind of firm it up, it does bring the weight up to about 567 grams. So these are actually way a little bit closer than you would think. So what's interesting about this is all the suspension springs are actually inside the seat post itself. It ships with one main spring, but you can add a smaller auxiliary spring if you're a heavier rider or want to firm it up. Similar to the Kinetic, it's got this kind of parallelogram design here that moves up and down. And with the Redshift, it has this little, what they're calling kind of a fender of sorts that's magnetic. And this helps protect these moving parts up here from road grime. To adjust the spring tension on the Redshift, you actually have to remove the seat post and set it from down here. There's a scale here, and you adjust it by turning this bottom cap. This compresses the springs, and there is a little scale here for repeatability. It does come with a sheet of paper with a little graph, which has the suggested spring settings for rider weight. For me, at about 180 pounds, I used both springs and dialed it in a little bit on the firmer side. And one thing to note is that since the spring mechanism is in the bottom of the seat post, you can't cut this down to save some weight. So ultimately, if you're a weight weenie and are wondering which one is lighter, they're about the same. This one could be potentially lighter because you could cut off some of the seat posts, but ultimately a wash in the weight department. So I've been riding with both these seat posts over the last month and a half. On my first ride, I actually brought both of them out and would swap them mid-ride to get a sense of how they use their suspension. I tried my best to set them at a similar firmness. I tried to make them both on the firm side so I wasn't getting any pedal bob on flat ground. So ultimately, this is what I found. The Kinetic seat post had a tendency to use most of its travel right away and then stiffen up at the end, whereas the Redshift seat post tended to ease into most of its travel. So what I found for me in terms of which is better for what terrain, I actually preferred the Kinetic seat post for really rough terrain where you're going over baby heads, maybe some slightly technical single track, something where you want to take off a lot of the big hits. Whereas with the Redshift, I felt like it was better tuned or more tunable to the kind of small bumps that you would hit on a gravel road. Overall, the sensation was pretty similar with both, but alternating on the same trail, on the same ride back to back, I was able to discern a little bit of a difference. So in my mind, if you're riding rockier terrain, maybe want to add some rear squish to a hardtail, then something like the Kinetic seat post would be the better choice. If, however, you're riding mostly gravel roads and aren't going to be soaking up big hits, but just want some kind of general, more subtle suspension over the length of your ride, and something like the Redshift seat post would do better. A couple of other nuances I found, although the Redshift seat post was a little bit more of a pain in the butt, no pun intended, to adjust the suspension because you did have to pull the seat post out. When you did make the suspension changes, it didn't really alter kind of the angle of the saddle or anything. And whereas with the Kinetic, although I appreciated this kind of external control knob, I found that when you adjust the tension, it does alter kind of the pitch of the saddle, necessitating some kind of saddle changes. So although this is easier to adjust the suspension, I did find that you had to kind of compensate the saddle position a bit. Whereas this one, not as easy to adjust the suspension, but didn't alter the pitch or angle or anything of the saddle. So what are the pros and cons of using these suspension seat posts? I found that actually one big pro was doing steep gravel climbs where you had to stay seated, otherwise you would break that rear traction, but oftentimes you would get bumped off by a big rock. They were both also awesome on rocky descents, as you would expect. On flatter, non-technical terrain, I tend to prefer the Redshift just because it wasn't as bobby as the Kinetic seat post. In terms of cons, weight is a big one. If you're running some kind of bikepacking saddlebag, these may interfere. If you have very little clearance between your bag and your front tire, when these go through their suspension, it's going to rub your bag on your tire. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by both the seat posts. I didn't really think of myself as the suspension seat post type, tending to like the simplicity of getting that suppleness out of the tire. But after testing both of these out, they've kind of actually won me over. I can see their use if you're doing an event or ride places where it's really rocky with lots of steep kind of technical climbs, or if you're a heavier rider, let's say over 200 pounds, 250 pounds, and it's unsafe to run your tires at low pressures to get that suspension. This allows you to gain some of that suppleness even though you're running your tires at a higher tire pressure. So that's what I think about these two suspension seat posts. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Do any of you guys run suspension seat posts yourselves? Would love to know your long-term experiences. If you want more accessory reviews, be sure to check out this playlist, and as always, keep the supple side down.